Good afternoon, everybody. I kind of dragged you in from the sun and the cookies, so I hope I'm worth it. So the first thing I wanted to say is that tech is now selling to everyone, and it's never really done that before. Technology sold to mainframes to big computers, or it's sold mini computers to medium-sized companies, or it's sold PCs to middle-class families. But as we go to mobile, for the first time the tech industry is selling to everybody on Earth. Back when we were all young and optimistic about the future, we thought that this growth looked pretty impressive. But the growth since the bubble is actually much bigger. There's now 3 billion people online and 2 billion people using these new smartphone things. And then in another few years, we'll go up to something like 4 billion people online, and all of those people will have smartphones. The thing that's really interesting about this is not so much the chart that goes up and to the right as the chart that goes down and to the right. That is to say, the number of people who are offline, the number of people who don't have the internet, is shrinking fast. By the end of this decade, we'll probably go to 3/4 of the population being online. Out of 5 billion adults on Earth, 4 billion, or over 4 billion, will have mobile, 4 billion will have smartphones, and PCs, and consumer PCs in particular, look very, very small in comparison with that. These new things, these new smartphones, are also supercomputers. A new iPhone CPU has over 600 times more transistors than a Pentium back in 1995. In the iPhone launch weekend, if you add up all the CPUs in all the iPhones Apple sold, they did about 25 times more transistors than were in all the computers on Earth back in 1995. So everybody gets a pocket supercomputer. And I do actually really mean everybody. I'm not just being a Silicon Valley visionary. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of the population is now under cellular coverage, and in the next few years, most of those people will get 3G coverage as well. That's more than have improved water, more than have electricity, and already 40% of people in Africa have cellular phones. Sub-Saharan Africa have cellular phones. In fact, the main barrier to adoption is actually data pricing and the ability to charge your phone. It's not access to a smartphone itself, because Android is now dropping well under $50 for a unit. The first thing that all of this changes is the internet. We are now post-Netscape and post-PageRank. That is to say, after 20 years of the web browser and the mouse and the keyboard being the way that everybody got online, we've now moved on to other things. And so the time spent in mobile apps is now greater than all the time spent on the web in the USA today. And that is also, of course, changing very fast, still changing very fast. If I was to say in 5 years' time I installed an app on my Android smartphone, I don't really know what any of those words would mean. I don't know what Android would mean. I don't know what a smartphone might be back in 2020. And we also have complexity in ecosystems, because in the past we had Microsoft and then we had the web browser and things were fairly straightforward. Now we have iOS and Android, but then iOS and Android look different depending on where you are and what you're trying to do. So 2/3 of people in San Francisco have an iPhone, but New Delhi it's rather different. 2/3 of revenue on the App Store it also goes to iOS versus Android, but then global browsing is split 50-50. Handset sales, Apple has maybe 10% of all the phones being sold on Earth, but Android has maybe 50%. And so ecosystems are no longer a straightforward question. It depends where you are and what you're trying to do. The biggest change, though, comes from the fact that smartphones are just so much more sophisticated than a PC. There's an old saying in computer science that a computer should never ask a question that it should know or be able to work out the answer to. And the number of sensors that are proliferating in smartphones profoundly change what it's possible for a computer to do. So you have this supercomputer with you, and it's watching you, for better or for worse, depending on what company you work for. But all of those sensors create new business opportunities. They create new ways of solving problems. When you pull those threads together, there's a leverage effect here. So there are 2 or 3 times more smartphones than PCs by 2020. But you need to multiply those smartphones because they're personal and they're taken everywhere and they're frictionless and they have sensors and cameras and payments and all these other things. And so actually it's not a 2 or 3 times increase in the opportunity. It's more like a 10 times increase in the opportunity. A good illustration of that is Facebook, which has built something of a multi-stage rocket. It now has a $6.5 billion run rate mobile ad business that's appeared out of nowhere in 24 months. Even more dramatically, WhatsApp is doing almost as many messages a year as the entire global SMS system, and it's doing that with just 30 engineers. That is to say, there's a leverage effect not just in usage, but in cost and in what it takes to get a startup out of the door. On the one hand, we've had a collapse, as we all know, in the cost of creating software and in the cost of building a product over the last decade or so. But on the other hand, the leverage effect means that you can get a business to much greater scale much more quickly. So the archetypal startup in 2000 might have had 100 staff and 1 million users. Today it might have 10 staff and 10 million users. And Yo was one Israeli engineer. He built a product in a weekend and got to 1 million users in 4 weeks without raising a penny. So mobile remakes in the internet. Mobile also remakes the tech industry, mainly because it's so much bigger. When 4 billion people are buying something every 2 years instead of 1.5 buying something every 5 years, you get way, way, way more units, which you can see quite clearly there. And that in turn means that the smartphone and tablet business is now almost half of the entire global consumer electronics industry by revenue. Another dramatic illustration, back at the peak of the film industry, the camera film industry, about 80 billion consumer photos were taken in 1999. This year, about 800 billion photos will be shared on social networks. The total number of photos taken could be anyone's guess, really, 10 times that, 100 times that. And more interestingly, again, more iPhones and Android phones have now been sold than the Japanese camera industry sold in its entire history. The camera has been eaten by the mobile phone. The other company that's been affected here, of course, is Microsoft, which has gone from selling the vast majority of connected computing devices to under a quarter, simply because there are so many more phones out there than there are PCs. And Apple, which is the minority player in the smartphone business, is now overtaking the entire PC industry, again, because of these kinds of scale effects. One of the things that's happening here is that the center of gravity of the tech industry is moving. So it used to be Seattle, tech used to be Seattle, mobile used to be Finland, and to some extent Japan. Now it's the San Francisco Bay Area beyond everything else. And the final effect that all of this stuff has on tech is that the supply chain turns into other things. And so you have this flood of cheap, high-performance, low-power, low-temperature chips being created for smartphones, and those are then tremendously useful for all sorts of other things. In the first instance, they're very useful for things like drones or wearables or Internet of Things devices, but they're also paradoxically useful for the biggest computing platforms we have as well as the smallest, in that they're pushing into data centers, because it turns out that if you build a building full of computers the size of a football field, your biggest costs are power and air conditioning, and so chips that don't use much power and don't get hot are actually quite useful. So the mobile is remaking the tech industry and it's remaking the internet. But what's actually kind of more interesting, even to people in the technology industry, is the way that it remakes other industries. Now, we already spend the majority of our time using media and communications, which of course now means using technology products. So the purple here is any media and communications activity, and the green is anything that isn't in front of a screen in the course of your day. And then, unfortunately, you have to spend some of your time asleep. And technology brands are already huge. So technology brands are now 40% of the value of the top 100 brands. Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon are almost 20%. And if you ask children what they'd miss, well, they say they'd miss mobile. A little bit of PC in there, also a few of the other legacy technology platforms like PCs and TV sets and games consoles. Media print is hidden somewhere in the other category up at the top there. But the thing that they really miss is their mobile product. And if you look at how teenagers communicate, again, email and phone calls of your grandparents. Although that's 50% of our activity, it's almost vanished when you look at teenage behavior. TV sets, meanwhile, are also in the minority. If you add up all of the screens that are used on Earth for people to watch video, TV sets are now less than a quarter. So when Eric Schmidt said a while ago that the majority of TVs you see in stores will have Google TV embedded, although he was wrong, he was also right at the same time. So glass is eating the world. The global sales of LCD screens this year will be about 4 billion square foot. So about almost a square foot of screen will be sold this year for every adult on Earth, and that number keeps going up. And yet the tech industry itself is still quite small, although it dwarfs things like music, where our screen is just high enough resolution to show it here. Even Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon combined there, or GAFA as the telecoms industry tends to call them, add up to less than TV business or advertising, and are much, much smaller than mobile or proper industries like cars or clothes, things that aren't trivial, things that are important and matter, unlike anything we do here, of course. But how does that change? How does technology become more? How does it take over more of the economy? Well, there's 3 phases of technology deployment. The first phase is that there are companies that make technology, which is what most of the companies we invest in do. Then there are companies that write a check to buy technology, and then there are companies that are created with technology, and that's a very different thing. A company that writes a check to technology is probably best summed up by this very, very clear visual image. the reason I've used this image is that an awful lot of companies that write checks for technology treat that technology rather like they treat a pot plant. That is to say, there's a guy you phone to get you a chair, or to get you a new keyboard, or to water your plant, or to fix your air conditioning. And he's sort of responsible for the technology, but he's not somebody, and it's kind of important, and you have a budget for it, but it's not something that your company is built around. It's not something that matters for how that company functions, how it thinks about the future of its industry. On the other hand, Amazon is a company that's built around technology. It spent the last 20 years pushing as hard as it can to convert all physical retail to e-commerce, every now and then accidentally making a profit as it goes. But one could ask, is Amazon a technology company, or is it a retailer that's created using technology? Incidentally, Amazon only has 1% of the entire US retail industry so far, so that opportunity has quite a way to go, so they probably won't bother making a profit for quite a way as well. But if you ask, well, what does it mean to be a technology company? Each wave of technology tends to create new businesses. So, for example, railways and the steam press created businesses like Hearst. Photography created Life magazine. Color printing created other kinds of magazines. Internet and social create entirely new kinds of media business like BuzzFeed. But these are all media companies. They're media companies built with a new technology, but they're media businesses. If you flip that comparison on its axis, Walmart and McDonald's were built, among other things, on trucking and interstate highways. They would not have been possible without them. The people who created them had a profound understanding of how those changed what it was possible to do as a retailer. But if I was to say, well, actually, McDonald's is really a trucking company, or for that matter, really a real estate company, that would sound very clever, but it would kind of miss the point that McDonald's is actually a food company. That if you speak to people at McDonald's headquarters who've worked there for 30 years, they say, well, I bleed ketchup. They don't say, I bleed petrol, or I bleed gasoline, or I bleed real estate. And the same at Walmart. Walmart is a retailer. Now, if you look at two of the most interesting companies that are technology companies that are changing the world, Airbnb and the combination of Uber and Lyft, these are companies created by technologists, built on technology, enabled by technology, but Airbnb is a travel company, and Uber and Lyft are transport companies. That is fundamentally what they do. To put this another way, when a technology is fully adopted, it tends to disappear. So this is the frequency of the word railway in all the books in Google Books' corpus since 1800. And as you can see, first people talk about railways, and then people stop talking about railways because they're just there. People talk about steel, and then they stop talking about steel. And then they talk about computerization. And every company now is computerized, so we don't talk about it anymore because it's just there. But you wouldn't say to any company that has computers in every building, in every room of every building that it has, that it's a computer company. And in the same way, we now see software as something that will fundamentally change every company. But it will change it by being absorbed, by becoming internalized, by creating entirely new businesses that will change those industries. So my colleague Mark Andreessen is fond of saying that software is eating the world. Another way of looking at this is that technology is outgrowing the technology industry. That is to say, because of all of the scale effects and all of the changes in the dynamics, because of this enormous opportunity of everybody on Earth for the first time being a customer of the technology industry, in effect what happens is that technology outgrows tech. It outgrows the tech industry because everything will be a technology company. It just won't necessarily look like one from the outside.